This week, we interview Beck Larson and Mike Weber from Coalfire to discuss PCI, primarily ASV scanning, although some general PCI topics were discussed. In the news, cloud security company BitGlass has raised $70 million in a late-stage round. LockPath announces significant updates to their Keylight platform. Trust Builder Identity Hub introduces simple and scalable processes for management of Docker. Pulse Secure has announced a collaboration with a new strategic authorized educational partner. Red Seal has raised $60 million in a round that has given a private equity company 70% share in Red Seal. Google has expanded its cloud security capabilities. Sysdig made an announcement uniting cloud-native visibility and security in a platform update. In the final segment, we air a security briefing from Secure World Boston with myself and Matt Alderman. So stay tuned for all that and more on this episode of Enterprise Security Weekly. This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where we talk security vendors and aren't afraid to name names. It's Enterprise Security Weekly. The greatest threat to businesses today isn't the outsider trying to get in. It's the people you trust, the ones who already have the keys, your employees, your contractors, and privileged users. 60% of online attacks are carried out by insiders. To stop these insider threats, you need to see what users are doing before an incident occurs. Observit combats insider threats by detecting risk activity, investigating in minutes, effectively responding, and stopping data lost. Give it a test drive at observit.com/securityweekly. Welcome, everyone, to episode 132 for Enterprise Security Weekly on April 10th, 2019. I'm, of course, your host, Paul Asadorian. I will introduce our guest next. A couple of quick announcements and advertisements. We're welcoming some new sponsors. Kaseya has state-of-the-art technology. You can automate many of your repetitive manual tasks that take up too much of your day while gaining visibility and control of remote and distributed environments. They put these powerful capabilities at your fingertips from a single pane of glass in one integrated IT management solution. Learn more about Kaseya by going to securityweekly.com/Kaseya. That's K-A-S-E-Y-A. All I can think of for that one is I'll replace you with a small shell script, which I love that. Viavi Solutions has two primary businesses, network and service enablement, and optical security and performance. Viavi has more than 3,500 employees in 60 offices serving the needs of global customers. To learn more about Viavi, go to securityweekly.com/Viavi. That's V-I-A-V-I. Alrighty, we're going to get right into it. There's no announcements. They're all in the next segment, which is good, because this segment is sponsored by Coalfire. Please visit securityweekly.com/Coalfire to learn how they can help you with your PCI program, not their PCI program. Although, if you take, anyway, maybe we'll talk about that. Today, we're going to be discussing various aspects of PCI, including the love, the praise, and the struggles we've observed and encountered over the years. I'm not going to do this by myself. With me today is, of course, Security Weekly host Jeff Mann, our resident expert on all things PCI. Welcome, Jeff.
Hey, glad to be here, Paul. And PCI was mentioned, so of course I had to be here.
That's right. It's going to be fun.
And we should already be drinking.
Yes. Everyone's drinking but me. Maybe we'll fix that.
I had we were in Orlando, was it just a week ago?
Yeah.
And I was standing in line to, get a free beverage during the vendor reception. And somebody behind me leaned into me and said, "If I say PCI, are you going to drink?" And I'm like, "Ah."
Oh, that's really
It was
funny.
a loyal listener.
There you go.
Right there in line.
We're joined by Mike Weber. He's the vice president at Coalfire. Mike's responsible for the oversight of Coalfire Labs operations, including penetration testing, application security assessments, forensics, and research and development. Mike has 20 years of experience in senior security positions, various technical fields, including enterprise security planning, network engineering, vulnerability and risk assessment, and penetration testing, as well as systems administration and programming. Mike, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Paul. Happy to be here.
Yeah, nice to have you. I didn't realize how in-depth your background went. We could have a long conversation about programming systems. I have a very similar kind of path.
Once you get pretty old, it seems you get to do a lot of stuff all over that
Saying
time.
I'm old too. I accept that.
You're getting there.
Yeah. We also welcome Beck Larson. She's the Director of Vulnerability Assessment Operations at Coalfire. Beck is a twice awarded Director of the Coalfire One Scanning Services team within the labs practice at Coalfire, I should say. She earned Team Member of the Quarter for successfully navigating the company's annual ASV Lab in 2015 and was recognized as a rising star within the labs organization at Hexacon 2018. Beck, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
I think it was the first moment I spoke with both of you. I'm like, you got to come on the show. Like this has been a long time in the making. It's really wonderful to have everyone here. So where do we want to start? I know we've talked about a lot of different topics in all things PCI. I'd like to start with the problem. And I know we mentioned struggles with the PCI programs, but specifically ASV scanning. So I think to start, talk a little bit about what ASV is. I mean, if people don't know by now, they may not. Yep. Start there, and then talk about some of the struggles with that particular aspect of PCI.
Sure. Well, actually, that's how Jeff and I came to know each other. We got together a few years back, spent many hours on the phone, just trying to brainstorm and troubleshoot, if you will, just the vague nuances of the ASV program. And it's incredibly hard to pass the lab. Not everybody can do it.
That's as an authorized scan vendor? Did I get that right?
Authorized scan. Well, yeah.
Approved.
Yeah. Approved. Yeah, there we go.
Approved
scan
approved
vendor.
ASV. We have so many acronyms.
A certain level merchant has to have regular scans by a third party.
Correct.
And what level merchant do you have to be?
So for SAQs.
That's where it immediately starts
to get tricky, right?
And that's why we spent so many years together talking, is because if we just take this one piece of the entire PCI realm and try to fix it, it's a domino effect. And you have to go into SAQ, and then you have to go into assessments, and you have to go into all of these other realms because they all connect. So, but with ASV especially, it's the guidelines are written well, but there are still some very key pieces that are open to interpretation. And so it depends on, as a certified ASV, how you interpret the guide, because you're allowed to do that, but then you have to back that up with reasoning, because you do get called on it. The customers the clients who are more in the know, they will say, well, my last vendor didn't do this. Well, your last vendor didn't do it right.
They didn't interpret they interpreted the standard differently, right? And level merchants is all the way from, like, when we go to a conference and we sell a few T-shirts and we use Square, right? All the way up to, like, Amazon, right? Would be one of the larger merchants.
Right.
And everyone in between. And those lines are kind of blurry, is what Jeff was kind of alluding to.
To add a little bit to the conversation, to fill it out a little bit, it was when I was working at Tenable, is when I first met Beck. And so, you know, Coalfire and Tenable were technically competitors, but we got together because we were trying to figure out this thing called approved scanning vendors. I didn't realize at the time, before I went to Tenable, that, and I think this is one of the problems, if we can talk about it, that for a lot of the quote-unquote world that has to do PCI, because they aren't the large level 1 merchants, they do what's called a self-assessment questionnaire. So they self-report in compliance. And the different card brands are the ones that stipulate what is required to be PCI approved or certified or compliant in terms of the level of size merchant you are. And mostly they all agree, and what they say is if you're smaller, fill out a self-assessment questionnaire, and you have to have 4 quarterly scans that are performed by a company that's been certified to perform the scans, which is called an approved scanning vendor. Because of that, many people that I discovered within Tenable and within the hacker security community think that all there is to PCI is this external vulnerability scan that's done once a quarter. And that's where we get a lot of the people saying, why do you talk about PCI so much? All it is a stupid scan that you do 4 times a year. There's no way you can be secure if that's all you're doing. So if anything, one of the big problems is sort of a perception issue of what's involved when you say you have to do PCI, if all you're seeing is, you know, a quarterly vulnerability scan.
Right. And then industry best practice says, at least monthly. Because think about it. If you scan first day of the quarter, you find all these vulnerabilities, and then you don't do anything during that quarter to remediate or dispute, then your QSA, hopefully, he or she's on his or her game, and they'll call you on it and say, what are you doing? Where's your due diligence? Where's your motive to actually make the risk in your environment go down? What have you done? It's not. It shouldn't be just a check the box thing, but I think without compliance, people wouldn't do it at all.
Right. There's a lot of components in the standard as well that require building a security program. The idea is not just to do that vulnerability scanning, but as you take the program together as a whole under all the 12 requirements, it does set the stage for an organization to put together a security program. So the standard it definitely it's in the right place. It's looking out for not just the security of the intellectual property of the card brands, but also helping an organization become better as well.
I think it's interesting if I think about the other types of assessments that we do as security professionals, whether external or internal. I'm sure in auditing, you probably have to get some type of certification to say you're compliant to this standard. Largely, and I think what Jeff was alluding to is a lot of the pen test firms or security assessment firms have been doing these assessments, and really you don't have to be certified in AppSec something associated with that to go look at an application and then make recommendations about security. But in PCI's case, largely because credit cards are being traded online so heavily and stolen, that this formal standard came about.
Right. I mean, this grew out of the Visa CISP program, Cardholder Information Security Program. I believe that's what it was called.
Yep.
That was the early days of it, and then the council got formed as an outcropping of this, which formalized it, and the card brands mostly got on board and have required this through acquiring banks to ensure they're all their merchants are demonstrating they're compliant with the standard. And that's what the ASV scanning program is. It's really, ultimately when you look at it in the picture of PCI, it's really a way to demonstrate compliance with one aspect of that whole standard. And it has, there's an industry behind it. We're in that industry. We built a platform to perform this scanning. I'm going to say over 10 years ago. It's
Wow.
It's
So
been
you
a
were
long time.
early to market and one of the first. I mean, that was back in the day where like the ASVs you could list on one page.
Subtle brag. We've been certified ASV since the beginning of the program, and we've never gone into remediation.
And it's what I've heard from folks over the years is it can be a very frustrating process to become an ASV.
Yep.
Where does some of this frustration, do you think, come from?
Well, part of the frustration that we see and the challenges that we see are not just with companies that want to provide this ASV service, but we've even got tool vendors. Because it's not necessarily just a tool. There's a process behind it.
Correct.
There are nuances to that process for how to, handle things that are false positives or special cases. And Beck can talk to that. She's a complete expert on that. But those challenges that we see within the tool vendor community, within our clients, trying to understand why isn't this just threat and vulnerability management? It's a little bit more than that. We built this tool again 10 years ago. And it has been a work in progress because the standard changes. We learned a lot through the process. And what we've done recently, we undertook a large rebuild effort. And that's what we just launched April 3rd, was our new platform. It's got capacity to handle large hyperscale environments like service provider type environments. And we've gotten through all of we've clarified a lot of the features of the standard through the platform and improving the user experience. And I mean, we've come a long way.
Now, when you say user experience, I think people might be confused if you hadn't. I had the privilege of working at Tenable and seeing this, this program, because I think I always thought of it as many likely still do, is that, well, to be ASV certified, like they're just running a scanner, and you could just run a scanner and be compliant. But that's one.
It's one aspect.
Actually, pretty small. I mean, it's an important component, but the work is in the process, Beck, right? Around how you handle the results.
Right, and there's also a people component as well. So to be clear, and Jeff, correct me if I'm wrong, because you're the PCI guy.
Don't worry, I will.
Oh, I know. That's why I love you. to be an ASV, to be a certified ASV provider, it's actually a test against your scanning solution. So
Right.
it depends on how you define solution, and again, everybody defines it differently. So back when you and I were talking originally, there were like 150 ASVs on the market. Now it's down to about 100 because it's very hard to pass the lab.
It's shrinking.
It's very much so, yeah. But again, we've been doing it for a long time, and we do it well. And back to Mike's point about the new platform, it's amazing. It's still built for simplicity. People can come in and they can schedule themselves, they can get the results and everything else. My team and I, everyone on my team is ASV certified. We are ethical to the nth degree because that is my take on it. I want it to be as transparent and as forthcoming as possible so that we can comply and that there isn't any question. This is how we interpret it. This is the way it is.
It's one of the more challenging aspects of vulnerability management that's in the ASV program, and that is, as you know, I've been systems administrator, security person. When you scan someone's systems internally in the organization, you find a bunch of vulnerabilities, you report it to them, and there's a lot of debate that can take place.
Oh, yeah.
That does take place. That's not a vulnerability.
Yeah.
You know, and
A
you're
running
like, no,
service was
but it
discovered.
is, right? But now you have to do this in an official capacity
Right.
to be compliant. And I think that's been a lot of the friction around the ASV program is likely in there. How do I dispute a vulnerability?
Right.
It's in my PCI
So
architecture.
to add just a little nuance, you were not wrong, but
But
well,
I got validation.
It's
Thank
just to clarify it a little bit. The program, the ASV program, on paper in its design is meant to be. There's a third-party service that's providing vulnerability scans for you, the whole package, the remediation and everything. But what the PCI Council allows, and what you're alluding to, and I just want to call it out, is that many of the ASV solutions are sort of self-help portals, where an ASV customer, a customer that's bound to do PCI, can log on to the website, they can upload whatever IP addresses, ranges, they can pretty much run the service themselves.
So glad you brought that up.
And it's only if there's issues, you know, because in theory all the results are supposed to be reviewed by a human, an ASV engineer, and that is a separate certification that your people have to go through.
The solution has to be certified, and that's what I caught before. The people have to be ASV,
certified.
Not QSA.
Nope.
Not QSA, it's different.
ASV certified people.
Correct. Yep.
So, you know, I hear you talking, and I know what you're talking about, but I just wanted to clarify it because, you know, a lot of people don't have the background, so that you know, unless we say it explicitly, I think it's sometimes lost.
Right.
So the program, if you're doing things right and your systems are secure and your vulnerability scans are not showing any results, it's basically a self-service type of process.
Most of it, yes.
Most of it.
However, Coalfire and yours truly, we also offer full service scans too.
Right.
It complies completely with the guidelines, complies completely with the council. And basically the only things we can't do for you as a client is determine your scope, because clearly outlined in the guidelines, we can't. We also cannot go into your systems and do remediation for you because of the third party aspect.
So the merchant determines the scope and is responsible for remediating all the vulnerabilities.
Well, they determine the scope, and they have to sign the attestation and say, we're putting our reputation on the line, saying that this is accurate. And an ASV, and it's true for QSAs too, we can sort of poke and prod and you know, did you consider this, did you consider that? But at the end of the day, it's the customer that says, no, this is our scope.
The responsibility falls on the merchant.
Yes.
Because there have been times in the past when a merchant has been compromised, credit cards have been stolen, and a lot of people are quick to point the finger at the ASV.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
But you're saying, what I just heard is, why would we ever do that given the way it's structured today?
Right.
Well, and in the early
Am I
days,
correct, Jeff?
yeah,
Okay.
in the early days of PCI, it was not well understood what was considered to be in scope. So in the early days, and if you look at the PCI standard, it's sort of written with e-commerce in mind. So, you know, you have a web server, you have an e-commerce server, you're selling something, and there's a checkout part and a place where you take payments. In the early days, people thought, well, that's what we have to have scanned. Where in reality, what you're supposed to be scanning is anything that's internet facing, whether it's directly involved in your e-commerce portion of
CD,
your
right?
program.
Touches, transmits, processes.
You know, so times have changed, but in the old days it would be, you know, mail servers, border routers, DNS servers, you know, anything that might be reaching out to the world that might be, you know, visible from the internet. You know, before net masking, it was anything that was IP addressable that you could do a scan of your range back in the days when companies would, you know, own a Class C,
right,
or that type of thing. It was supposed to be inclusive of anything, regardless of whether it was directly related, unless and until you could, and it's not so much true, I think, from the ASV. Correct me if I'm not wrong, but in terms of card data environment, that's more of an internal thing, but card data environment from an internet-facing perspective, from an ASV perspective, doesn't matter as much as, no, anything that's out there that we can see is supposed to be part of the ASV scan.
Yeah. And actually, one of the struggles, back to your earlier question, is how do you define that, right? So per the guidelines, if you've got correct perimeter control in place, I shouldn't be able to see any of your CD.
Right.
Shouldn't. So you can run a scan, you can get back 0 live hosts, it's a pass. Right?
And that we were talking about that last night.
Yeah, I know.
But because most people, especially if it's a QSA reviewing or, you know, whoever the report's going to, the banks or the card brands, there should be something there.
What's there? Right. But if you do it correctly, I mean, scan interference aside, right? Take down those protections.
What do you mean by scan interference?
Oh man, that's like a 3-day conversation. That is okay. So,
but just at a high level.
All right. Side jaunt, right? So scan interference is a PETA. We deal with it a lot on my team, and my team are technical experts, ASV certified, and legitimately, if you're dealing with someone who has to hop over or under an ocean, you're going to have scan interference of some sort. Or if you're dealing with a large-scale provider, you've also got many different things in place that, as the engineer of like if I was the client and I was an engineer there trying to figure out the network and why something's not getting through, I may not know that, you know, some other provider that we contract with has a WAF in place or has IDS in place. I don't know. I didn't see the change ticket. I wasn't on that change control approval board. It just happened. So we have to trace it back. We test it from various points. And that's part of the ASV responsibility, is to make sure that we can get to your environment, we can adequately scan you, we can get you accurate results. Accuracy is huge. And then we can discuss, okay, we've got this issue. So like certificate issues are huge, and it depends on the scanner as well, right? It depends on how the check is written. If it's, I hate the X509 certificate issue. I hate it because it doesn't, all the scanners, right? Tenable, we partner with Rapid7, and they're wonderful. All of the scanners that I've ever dealt with, and I've been doing this many, many years, certificates are always an issue. If they're self-signed, they're not going to be picked up. If it's GoDaddy, it's not going to be picked up. So it's always, you're failing. And then you have to go back to the client. Hey, can you prove that this is legit? And then they send back a screenshot and everything's cool. So full service scans, that's all that the customer needs to do. They need to figure out their own scope. Then we take care of it. We say, thanks for your scope. Tell me your blackout windows. We'll schedule it. We'll make sure it runs. We'll babysit to the end. No scan interference. Fantastic. Here's your report. I've analyzed it. Here's what I think. Certificate issue, probably a false positive. I just need the evidence. Please give it back to me. Then if it's me or someone on my team, we'll submit the dispute on behalf of the client. Completely cool. Someone else, though, you can't, you know, check out your own backyard. Someone else needs to review it. And if we can test it remotely, because of the guidelines, you have to. If we can test it remotely, then we can accept it.
Question about remotely and scan interference. And I've had this discussion in the past when we were at Tenable. Now, do you scan from the outside going in, or do you have a scanner inside the network and are able to scan those systems? And what does PCI give you for guidance on how you should do that?
Me. Both. both. So ASV is all external, and there's a ton of guidelines around. It's required, blah, blah, blah. Internal is also required for PCI guidelines, but you do not have to be an ASV to do them. Gotcha. We have a proprietary device called a Lighthouse. We have so many different types of lighthouses now. It's all cloud-based. The whole world is changing. I'm sure Mike can speak to that, and I would like you to, because it's awesome. But we also have like a 1U like rackable unit, up to 5,000, 10,000 IPs, and then we also have this little cigar box shaped, legitimately, device, and you just plug it in. Thing is, it needs to be internet connected so that we can get updates to it weekly. Because checks evolve, 0 days happen. We need to get that up there. But yeah, so it has to be behind your perimeter. We can scan.
Well, to add to that,
go ahead.
You know, I'm all about clarification. In terms of scan interference, that's an external scan requirement that's part of the ASV program, and the way it's written, it says, you know, if you have perimeter protections in place and you have a very small footprint, nothing's really visible or answering, you can have a valid ASV scan that produces 0 results. What you can't have to produce a valid ASV scan result is anything in place that's going to start blocking. It detects a port scan, it's detecting the scan activity and blocks it midway. That's what ASV says, no, you can't do that. So a lot of the scan interference, if it's interference that's happening right from the start by design, it's not technically interference in terms of ASV rules.
Right. And I was before I got into this into the PCI business as a consultant, I was a customer. So I was responsible for e-commerce systems that we had, and I had it set up so that if I saw something that looked suspicious or traffic I didn't like to see, I black hole it. I was getting feedback from the ASV vendor that we were using at the time that we couldn't do that. Isn't that broken? isn't that if we're testing the security, we should test the security controls as well. That was my concept at the time. I have obviously drank the Kool-Aid and understand what scan interference is all about.
I think this is part of what the security hacker community struggles with, because as practitioners, we think it's important to know what your vulnerabilities are, not that you have some sort of perimeter defense set up. But that's actually the role of the internal vulnerability scan. It's perfectly legitimate to have an external scan where you have different protections set up to block it. That's okay.
Because I think the elephant in the room is today, in the past 5 years, very rapidly, it's all about apps, users, and data. When attackers want to go after you, they're not doing a port scan and doing a remote exploit, you know, over the internet. They're attacking the user. They're trying to find the data, and that could mean that they're finding an S3 bucket somewhere or whatever, right? And they're attacking the application. And
and a good example really, of that,
you know, kind of just the transport layer for all of that stuff, and is not the way we think of it 5+ years ago, where that's part of the attack vector.
A good example of that, and I'll pose it as a question to you guys, many merchants are conducting brick and mortar operations, and so they have what we used to call cash registers, but are, to use the language, it's point of sale systems. It's where a transaction's occurring. More and more merchants, especially that are nationwide operations, because of the advancement in technology, they don't have to have private internet connections anymore. They go over the internet. So there's the possibility, at least, that endpoint, what we used to call endpoints, point of sale systems, are they themselves internet reachable and addressable. So my question to you guys is, do you encounter that? Do you have customers that recognize that and include that in their ASV scans? Everything, including what we used to think of as endpoints that are in theory internal, but because of technological advances are internet reachable?
So what we see a lot of our customers doing is they take advantage of being able to limit scope of PCI compliance by segmenting off certain controls so that they don't have to look at their entire enterprise, and it's really only those systems, point of sale systems, and the other systems.
Part of PCI I hate the most, but go ahead.
Is the scope limitation, and one of those things that has gotten really fuzzy with the advancement of technology is, what does internal mean? If you're hosted in cloud environments, it isn't really internal. It is internal because it's owned by them, or whatever. They're allowed to be able to address those systems, but it gets very odd that way. And that was actually,
if it's a 10 dot address, it's internal, right?
Okay. there's the obvious bits and how you address it from an organization, but that's where we built our Lighthouse platform as a cloud deployable device. And our first foray into that was having something that can be deployed through Amazon into an environment such as that, so that we can look at it from that internal perspective. And it seems to it has satisfied the needs of lots of those clients who have been going to the cloud, because that's where the future is. Actually, it's where the present is, really.
That's interesting, but I don't know that you answered my question. I mean, do you have customers that have point-of-sale systems that are internet reachable that are included in ASV scan?
We actually do. We have, and we've discussed this internally, at least on my team, ad nauseum. Like is it internal? And then next month we'll include it on the external. It depends on also who your QSA is and how they're interpreting results. I mean, in all fairness, you're completely correct. I'm correct. We're all correct. You can have a passing scan that has 0 live hosts.
Right.
But if your QSA is on a security instead of a compliance viewpoint, they're going to question that. And they're going to ask, okay, well, based on your question, is it internal or external? At the end of the day, it doesn't matter. It just needs to be secure. Reduce the risk. Get rid of the vulnerabilities. Fix your
really the role
stuff.
of the QSA, right, is
Right.
to say, okay, I don't have any exposed vulnerabilities to the internet. However, all of my point-of-sale systems have not been patched in the past 3 years.
Right.
From a hacker perspective, that's a huge problem, right?
Yeah.
I mean, internal segmentation
benefit from
aside, that's really just a couple more roadblocks. Having point-of-sale systems that are not patched, that are on the internal network, is today, once I get on there from the internet, now it's just fair game. And to be quite honest, I've been on assessments where I've been able to do that before.
Right.
Yeah.
So
It's a painful thing to say yes to that question.
yeah.
Oh, it is, but it's a reality.
Right.
But what I gathered from this, I'm learning more and more about PCI every time we have these conversations, is that it's about a limitation of risk. Because if you think about if it is exposed to the internet over the network in a network port, that's a really high degree of risk. It is, although some may disagree, less risk to be firewalled off and not accessible from the internet, but internally there may be ways to access it. But those are two different levels of risk, right?
There are, and here's the good and the bad. You know, I said that what I hate about this idea of scope reduction. What I like about scope reduction, when merchants figured out, ooh, we don't have to do as much PCI if we can, declare a segment of our environment and say that's card data, and so that's what they call the card holder data environment or CDE. To be able to get there, they initially had to figure out data flows, process flows, find all the 5 million places where card data was being stored in the network for various reasons that nobody knew about. So the good thing about the exercises was merchants were able to clean up their environment and do things that security practitioners like reduce your footprint, reduce your exposure. A lot of my merchant customers found out, oh, we don't need to store the cardholder data. Why not? Why keep it at all? And the rule of thumb for what makes PCI happen is if there's a card number present. That's what kicks all of this off. So the good thing was inadvertently customers were cleaning up their environment, understanding where things were flowing in terms of sensitive data throughout their environment, and they went through the process of isolating things. What I don't like about it is so many of these customers are doing it for the explicit purpose of, I only have to do security here.
Ugh.
Right.
And not everywhere else.
Yeah.
And
well,
when they take that approach, I think they're losing.
It's a reduction of risk, right? I think sometimes the perception in the back of people's minds is, well, we have PCI, so therefore there should be 0 card data breaches. That's obviously that's utopia, right? But it's not reality. But the other end of that spectrum is where we were before PCI, where there was a lot of card breaches and there was poor practices that got largely cleaned up. And that's not to say we don't have any breaches, but it's gotten a lot better in terms of how merchants handle and process.
Well, it's gotten a lot better, but the bad guys have also gotten smarter.
Oh, yeah.
In the early days of PCI, the thinking was, and this is sort of in the early days of internet security, was a bad guy doing their own risk assessment wants to get in and get out and take as much as possible in as little time as possible. So the presumption is, wherever your crown jewels are, wherever your repositories or databases of the millions of cards, that's what you want to go after, and so that's what you want to protect the most. And that's the whole concept of internet security, perimeter security, layers of protection, all those types of things. But what the bad guys figured out, and this sort of started, it's been 5 years now at this point with the Target and the Home Depot breaches, but it's still happening a lot today, is the bad guys figured out ways of harvesting and collecting small amounts of card data, primarily from those endpoint point-of-sale devices at smaller merchants that there isn't as much attention paid to them, or,
Sure.
or because they're small, they sort of fall under the radar.
And instead of getting in and out quick, they stay in.
They just
and
stay
they
in it,
lurk.
and they do it over time.
A trend that I noticed a couple of years ago, maybe, where they were targeting smaller merchants with persistent malware. That was just, I can put it on more, you know, different types of merchants and still collect the same amount, but fly under the radar.
It's, you know, it's like distributed processing on your brand new screaming laptop where you've got how many processors in it. You know, you're distributing the, you know, what used to fill up one processor over 20. You know, it's the same sort of concept. You can get 10 million cards, 100 at a time from, do the math, 10,000 different small retail locations.
And that's the latest trend is JavaScript malware on e-commerce sites, because now there's more, before when the PCI standard first came about till today, a lot more e-commerce sites. And now they can inject JavaScript in all the ones that they can, and it turns out that's pretty fruitful. And there was just, I covered it yesterday. There was a security firm that did an analysis and said there's actually a lot more variants of this JavaScript malware that are generic and that are specific to certain types of open source and commercial e-commerce software.
Well, and it goes back to your initial question about, you know, the different size of merchants and what determines ASV and PCI. The presumption is the large companies have the large amounts of data, and they have to have more scrutiny. In fact, they're the ones that get the QSAs. All the quote-unquote little guys, you know, don't often have a QSA that they're working with at all. They can't afford it, but they don't have to.
Exactly.
Because they're self-assessing.
Depends on the SAQ, and of the 9, only 5 are required for scan.
Well, and the levels of the merchants are determined by how many transactions one does, not the dollar value of the transactions.
Right.
Because it's how many individual pieces of data, that intellectual property.
So the little guys aren't being scrutinized, if we can use that term. But that's where the bad guys are focusing now, and pretty much flying under the radar. I mean, I haven't looked at the stats lately, but I looked at it a lot when the Target and the Home Depot breach was happening. For every one of those companies that you see in the news or on Krebs, there's hundreds, if not thousands, of smaller companies that are suffering breaches, but they're not newsworthy because they're not the name brand that you recognize.
The shock value. Always shock value.
And that's what we're talking about here, is also those organizations that have to demonstrate this compliance, which is based on level. You have to demonstrate it to your acquiring bank, or you have to demonstrate it to, well, whomever is going to get it. But when we look at the companies that have to get the services from a QSA to validate what they're doing, those are only the level 1 merchants. Those companies that are, you know, level 2 and below have to do the self-assessment questionnaire and are basically attesting that they do everything right. There's no third-party oversight to that. There's also, this is where it gets vague, and I'm going to ask you to correct me because I'm sure I'll be wrong, that in the standard, there's nothing that says that if you're of a certain size, you don't have to do ASV scanning, nor there's nothing that says that you don't have to do penetration testing. In theory, the entire standard applies to everyone. But it's about demonstrating the compliance for those organizations. Outside of the ASV scanning component, we also do penetration testing for PCI. And we do penetration testing for organizations, typically the level 1 merchants that are that hit that threshold because they have to have it demonstrated. But we'll also do for some other environments that are doing, you know, best practices, due diligence, getting penetration testing done by an outside firm, even though they don't have to do it. They just know that it applies and they pursue that. And there's an interesting difference between our clients. A lot of the clients who have to have the services of a QSA, I'm going to generalize, on average, are, it's another term, and it's the definition of what is secure, are less secure than those companies that are looking at it from a due diligence process and knowing that's the right thing to do. There's more investment from those companies, and they're more concerned, and they recognize the value of the service that's happening, that it's, you know, from their perspective, it demonstrates that they're doing the right thing, even though they don't need to do this per the standard.
Well, and generally speaking, in your observation, how have those companies gotten to that point where they're doing it because it's the right thing to do?
So how they've gotten there is a great question. Every company is unique. Everybody's in their own different situations. Generally, these are companies that have a more mature security program internally.
Right.
Because they've been breached in the past?
That's kind of what I was leading towards.
Well, that's how you get budget, right?
Usually companies get religion after they've
Yeah.
been through the breach.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
then they start doing it the right way.
Right.
Because they have budget.
Right.
Yep.
And unfortunately for those companies that do get breached, they get told, you weren't doing this.
Yep.
And you're supposed to be doing that. They say, well, I don't have to show it, so why do I have to be doing it?
Right.
So
I can see that, especially with application scanning. How do you validate the application? I mean, having a background in vulnerability management, there's light features, I feel like, inside of the scanners when it comes to applications, web applications specifically. Obviously, there's
Correct.
far
Yep.
more in-depth tools, scanners, and then manual analysis that can happen on the web application.
Right.
How do we deal with that as PCI, where a lot of what we're protecting today is really the app?
Well, there's one answer that says you don't, because PCI does not require an application level vulnerability scan.
Mm-hmm.
If that's if the right way to call it. It's an option.
Mm-hmm.
It's an either or. Either that or put a web application firewall in place. And a lot of
In
people
which
opt for
The
that.
definition of that is
Right.
blurred today as well.
Correct.
It
Yeah,
is.
It's all vague.
So it's sort of a loophole.
It is.
And in doing that, as an ASV provider, we have not only our primary platform that is powered by our partner Rapid7's technology, but we also add layers onto that. So as we've rebuilt this platform, we've added features to it. We've also added other technologies that help address things like application issues, because we want to do what's right. We don't want to do the minimum for the client. Clearly,
Right.
that doesn't make the world a better place, and
Right.
that's one of the.
But I think to be
philosophical things we're
clear,
out for.
an ASV scan is not required to do any particular level of application level
Gotcha.
scanning other than...
There is
It
some
goes
detail.
back
There's-
to how you interpret.
Yeah.
Well,
the
it goes back to
guide.
interpret, but
Yep.
show me something in writing in the guide or wherever that says, well, like, from a tenable perspective, do you do a credentialed scan or an uncredentialed
Right.
scan?
Right.
Right.
There's no really distinction made in
And
the
in all
ASV
honesty,
program.
like for the uncredentialed versus credentialed scans, when it comes to an honest, real conversation with a client who's concerned about security, they want credentialed scanning.
Sure.
Because they want to know all of it. From a client who's more concerned with compliance, no
Yeah.
credentials. Because
I've observed that over the past too.
yeah, you get either 100 vulns back or 10.
Mm-hmm.
And if you've only got 90 days and you've got a team of 2, maybe, working
Right.
on fixing everything, what do you want to deal with and still get compliance?
Right. Depending on
Not
the
get
client, depending on the technology,
Correct.
a
And
credential
context.
scan on an application, it increases the attack surface exponentially in certain
Right.
cases.
Yeah.
So I have a question for you guys, if I may.
Sure, go ahead.
Yes, sir.
We were talking a little bit about this last night over dinner. So you have a client and they have a scan result and there's a finding that is something that they're supposed to address. And let's say the fix is to install a patch. And let's say that patch has been out for, 3 years.
Long time.
Do you go to any level to address the process issues that are necessarily involved in why has this thing been here for 3 years?
So I will tell you again, so before Coalfire, you can OSINT the crap out of me, everybody. Go for it. I'm on LinkedIn. It's there. So you
And
can,
Twitter.
And Twitter now. I know. I begrudgingly opened a Twitter. I just
MySpace?
No, back in the day, but I.
It's still there.
Oh, God, you're a stalker.
Unless you had audio files and then they're not there.
Oh.
Because they
man.
did a cut over and there's a whole story.
Oh
about
yeah.
that.
They lost all their. Oh,
Well,
that's
lost,
sad.
air quotes. I don't know. I
Yeah.
have a conspiracy theory about that. Anyway.
I would like to know it. Where were we? Scanning 3 years.
Scanning 3 years.
Patching.
Do
Okay.
you address the process
Right.
issues?
So, as an ASV, you don't have to because
Mhm.
again, people do the minimum that's required, right?
Right.
And that's just it's like water flowing down a mountain. Go take the easiest path, right?
Right.
I don't like that, so I encourage my team constantly, like, hey, if you see something weird in this environment, especially as we're taking our current existing clients on our legacy platform and putting them onto our new platform, take a look. What seems fishy here? You've got a whole bunch of TLS issues. What does that mean? Take a look at their environment. Take a look at how many times they're scanning. Do they know how to use the tool? Do they need our help? So if you reach out and you say, hey, why isn't this patch here? Oh, usually, honestly, what I usually hear, typically in my experience, is employee turnover, forgot about it, don't know how to use the tool,
Yep.
don't care. And it's, So yeah, I mean,
or there's a dependency that they can't install
correct.
a patch.
That for the bigger providers.
That's the excuse.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
Well,
sure.
downstream, all of these production systems are going to go offline if I patch this here.
Right.
Okay, well then what are you doing as a compensating control to
Mm-hmm.
protect your environment against the risk that you're running an outdated whatever? You know, and it's just, yeah.
Well,
It's interesting. I forget where the data came from. A few different sources. One was the recorded future browser plugin that correlates a CVE to the malware that they derive from threat intelligence and what exploits they're using. And typically what they find is the malware running around today, when you use that browser plugin on a scan report, will say, hey, this malware is using or exploiting vulnerabilities that are more than a year old. And the newer vulnerabilities really aren't being exploited, despite what we like to think is security professionals.
That's because the bad guys are lazy too.
Yeah.
And if the old stuff works, why stop?
It takes
Right
time
once,
to
use
perfect an
many.
exploit for a
Right.
vulnerability, as we all know.
They've got their
right?
own DevOps that they have to go through.
Yeah. And so a 3-year-old vulnerability is bad.
Bad
More
and,
so
and
than-
still
sure.
fair game.
I like that
Right.
he uses 3 years because I've
It's-
seen things
I
like
was being generous.
Yes.
a
right.
decade, and you're like,
But
what are you doing?
You brought up what perhaps is a maybe a contentious issue, but you mentioned TLS. So what is your stance as an ASV on TLS 1.0, 1.1, 1.2, 1.3?
Did you hear that big sigh?
I did.
Okay, we don't have 3 hours to talk about this, Jeff.
Bottom line.
It's back to Weber's point from earlier. It's context.
Mm.
Who are you? What are you doing? What does your data do? Why are you doing it? And so that's where also, to your point earlier, it's hard to define where you stop and where you begin as an ASV and a QSA.
Yeah.
So
Well, let me rephrase the question. How do you in general handle vulnerabilities associated not necessarily with known exploits or malware, but with the authoritative agency, let's say NIST, that says this is deprecated and should not be used?
Oh, man. So again, we don't have 3 weeks to talk about this because, okay, so literally, let me give you like a day in the life of my team.
Okay.
A client will come back. They have TLS issues across the board. What can we do to fix this? Well, you can do this, this, or this. If you want just compliance, let's read the solutions, like the recommendations for your environment. Well, we can't do that. Why not? Context, whatever. What are you doing? They come back. We've protected it in X amount of ways. But then what we do is we work with our partner, Rapid7, and we say, hey, this check is weak here, here, and here. And I have highly technical people on my team. They do the research. They go out to NIST. They exploit if they can. Not exploit, that's not the right word. They test
easy.
if they can remotely. I know, right? They don't act. We, again, as ASVs, we're not allowed to knock it over. We're not allowed to poke and prod. We're just allowed to say,
You're not pen testers.
correct.
Yeah.
And that's another thing that it's funny. Scanning is not pen testing. Pen testing is not scanning. Scanning is a part of pen testing, depending on how you approach
Shouldn't
it.
be, but that's a
Yeah.
whole nother
I
topic.
know.
That's a whole other
Man,
segment.
we got to
Right.
come back like 5 times to cover all this stuff. But yeah, I can't
TLS
really.
issues are
it's-
they're, let's be honest, they're a pain in the butt.
And they're gonna be
We're
around
Tenable for a long
forever.
time, and it's a pain.
Yeah.
It's just
It's a pain.
there's so many different protocols and different versions of the protocols and different.
Yep.
Everyone has their own interpretation of the RFCs. Is really what it comes down to. So everyone's SSL implementation is different, and so it creates a nightmare.
My issue with that is that your biggest problem, right?
Yeah.
From an
No,
organizational
it-
perspective.
It's
Yeah.
a great point.
There are organizations that have
Mhm.
many more things to deal with, but they also have to deal with this, and that is a specific because it's bad, but it's not something that would merit a real investment into
It's not like a backdoor issue.
being
Right,
able to
right.
overcome it.
Is
So
there anything in PCI that deals with a software inventory? Right, because a lot of what we're talking about, having vulnerabilities, whether you have software that you've purchased or implemented, or you've written software yourself, which now today largely incorporates, open source libraries and software. Is there anything that says you have to have a software inventory and report on what's vulnerable based on that inventory, independent of a scan? Some of the SSL issues can be solved by inventory.
No.
Where is my vulnerable OpenSSL libraries?
There
that are being
is
checked
a
into my-
PCI DSS requirement to maintain an inventory of all your system components, and the definition of system component in PCI is inclusive of software.
Okay.
But there is not a specific requirement that says, now that you have this inventory, do anything in particular with it, other than keep it current. In theory, you have this inventory so that when you're monitoring external sources of vulnerability information, you're like, oh, a vulnerability just came out on widget XYZ, and we know on our inventory that we use that in certain of our systems, so we know we need to do something with it. The reality is a lot of companies, and correct me if your experience is different, they wait for the scan to run to find that, and then they act upon it.
Right.
Yeah, we see the same thing across the board. And the system inventory and software inventory and libraries and dependencies gets to be pretty challenging once companies are moving to the cloud. To be able to they share the responsibility to manage specific portions of the system. There may not be that level.
They don't know
of
they're
detail.
sharing it. They think they've outsourced it.
Right.
But that's another issue.
Outsource, share. Tomato, tomato.
Liability, yours, mine.
Right. Yeah.
Ours.
What's the contract say?
So that's
that's an interesting situation, as we've just seen a vulnerability in Apache that if you're on a shared hosting environment, you don't have to be vulnerable, but if someone else is, they can get root on that shared hosting environment, and now they can own everyone.
Yep.
What do we do in PCI in that instance where there's nothing for me to patch? It's on the hosting provider, and I think shared web hosting is kind of a bad example because if it were me and I had an e-commerce site, I wouldn't put it on a shared Apache web instance. But
it's interesting you bring it up, and I'll put it in the form of a question for you guys. But PCI has specific requirements that are called out if you're a shared hosting provider, and that's existed for a long time. And the definition as it exists today is going back to the early days of e-commerce, where you're a hosting provider and you're hosting multiple customers on the same hardware server.
It was more common 10 years ago.
It was much more common.
Cloud, I mean, it's
Well, with cloud, it's
different.
We've had debates in my company of whether the definition of shared hosting provider extends to cloud environments, container environments, where it's no longer a physical server that's hosting multiple websites. It's containers and Dockers.
Not
and
even
AWS.
that. Even more extreme, it's serverless.
Yeah.
I can just drop my code up into Lambda or into Azure, and it just runs.
So if you're a company like, let's say, Amazon, that's hosting 10,000 different merchant companies in whatever, is Amazon a shared hosting provider?
Right.
Because the definition says it's multiple customers on essentially a hardware server, web server.
Right. It's an old school definition.
It is an old school definition,
especially with this serverless stuff. I mean, it's got huge advantages. Our R&D team. I know we're not talking about our R&D team, but
we should, though. It's
you
awesome.
can.
Shameless plug. Our R&D team just released. We built a password cracker that's completely serverless, and it runs using Amazon services. We released it open source because it was kind of a study into how do you get away from having to manage all that hardware. Because it's expensive, being able to build, maintain, expand your cracking rig. I mean, it's not as awesome as that massive system you just got, but but that's the idea. Is it's expandable, and you can leverage those services in that serverless architecture and be able to manage how much you want to do on a particular password cracking job. But that kind of service those services become really challenging.
Well, and PCI
I think that leads into what's coming next for PCI, and what are the things that maybe we can expect or want. I certainly have my wish list of things that I would like to see in the standard. Threat hunting is one that we talked about. Today we covered applications and application scanning.
We should talk about APIs too.
And APIs.
Yeah,
absolutely.
we should.
Actually, I did an awesome briefing with an API company that I'll give them a plug because I did a briefing with them. And 42 Crunch. Awesome demo. Really, really awesome people.
I've been sort of researching this for the last couple weeks because we have a customer asking the question, and I'm learning all about it. Can an API be used to create network segmentation for scope reduction, which is the ultimate goal?
That's an interesting question.
It is an interesting question. I'm not sure I'm ready to answer it yet.
I don't like it. I don't like your question. I reject it.
I don't feel smart enough to be able to to actually comprehend what that really means.
Well, when we can an API be used for access control in the way that what
That's
used to be done with
uncomfortable,
routers
Jeff.
and firewall rules.
You're
But that's where we're
correct.
going.
I know.
That's
it's
where
just-
we're headed.
There is
I don't like
many
it.
solutions do have a protection component in the
Right.
API, which feels
Yeah.
like a WAF, but it's just different because it is an API and it's implemented differently.
I think I haven't drawn the conclusion yet, but I think where I'm going is, yes, it's possible, but there's a lot of work involved. It's labor intensive,
Yeah.
and it might require third-party add-ons. But simply signing up for the service because it's cost reduction, I'm getting rid of hardware, and I'm going to do things a new
Right.
and different way, doesn't automatically buy you. Much the way just moving to the cloud just for the traditional web hosting doesn't automatically buy you
Right.
anything
Right.
more than what the contract says.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the whole on the API front, what we've seen, and we've had in our customers outside of just the ASV world,
Right.
we've seen APIs that are built as an afterthought, as an add-on, as an
Right.
additional service onto an existing platform. We have a case study. We did some work in the automotive field. Concept was to gain access to the telematics unit. We're looking at from the CAN bus side and all of these high-tech approaches. Part of this was it was an electric vehicle, so it had a mobile app companion. Using the mobile app to be able to tell how much your charge is and if you can make it from here to Walla Walla, Washington, or whatever, right? And be able to manage your electric vehicle in that mobile app. The API that supports the mobile app, unauthenticated access to other vehicles, and that was our big deal. After all of the work we did at the sensor level and CAN bus up, that really it was the API that was built without the the object ownership check.
Well,
for
it was
the
built
vehicle.
to solve a problem,
Right.
and it worked.
It did.
Yeah, the problem with
It
APIs,
worked for a lot.
we
of
talked about on
customers.
our call, on my call today with 42 Crunch, and they have a lot of experience, and I asked them, like, basically when a developer implements an API, there's really very little that would help them do it securely, implement it securely. And
Right.
then the problem is compounded because every framework, every language and component has a different API that's in a different language and in a different platform, and how do you secure it? And that's
Right.
challenging. But for the future of PCI, I mean, I come back to those three areas of threat hunting, application security, and software inventory, and taking a harder stance, I think, in those three areas.
I dig it.
In the conversations we've had here at Security Weekly and today with you folks from Coalfire, I think for me, that's what I'd like to see, although I don't know if you have any insights as to what's coming next or what you'd like to see in future PCI revisions.
I can't add to that. That's amazing. Because
Yeah.
honestly, like, we have to keep up with keeping up.
Right.
I mean, every day it changes, the landscape changes, the threats change daily, by the minute, that bleeding edge, whatever. So, that's amazing.
But
I
what-
completely agree.
Yeah, and one of the changes in PCI is that they're sunsetting the PADSS program. So the PADSS program is the Payment Application Digital Security Standard.
Data security standard.
Thank you. I knew I was gonna get that wrong.
As soon as you said it, you knew.
Damn acronyms.
I think being corrected by Jeff is a reason to drink.
And your glass is empty.
It is.
So one of the things they're doing is they're sunsetting that program. They're replacing it with a secure software development program, or that's the concept of it.
Okay, I like
so
that.
there's that is moving forward, which I think is a great direction for the standard to go. But to be able to prognosticate what's going to go on with the rest of the standard gets really hard. And the only thing that I've seen, and I'll say it here, in things that say it may be coming, was there was a special interest group that put together an information supplement on penetration testing, and it was updated as late as I think 2017. And in there's a case study that talks about social engineering, which has never been traditionally part of the PCI standard. So that's the only thing that I could possibly see coming.
Sure.
Crazy,
I think
'cause there's
that's
a huge people component.
I
to
can
all
I can
this.
lower
Oh
your
my God.
expectations.
Physical security and people security. You can
Right.
kind of go hand in
Right.
hand, that social
Right.
engineering context. Sure.
I'll take a stab at answering your question, and this is based on I've been involved since 1.0, so I don't know how many version upgrades there have been.
So who's older?
Probably eight or nine over the years. The PCI Security Standard Council, something that they're very adamant about is to try to be vendor and technology neutral. So every time there's been a new version coming out, I've had hopes of, hopefully they'll address this or that, and invariably they don't. And not to defend the council, but I think the logic is that if you look at the data security standard at a macro level, there's principles of security there. It's a framework of security that is designed to be sort of vendor and technology neutral.
Sure.
And it's up to somebody else to figure out how it applies given the new technology.
Right.
Now,
Because
here's the problem.
compliance will drive capitalism.
Right.
They said you need an API security solution and was specific about it. That could benefit right now 10 vendors in a very positive way.
Yep.
So yeah, I get
so my expectations are low. Version 4 is in the works, and the council is in a period right now where they're accepting ideas and input.
Hopefully they're listening to our top 3 list that we've agreed upon.
Yeah, we've agreed to it, but they're not going to hear that. It has to be written up in a certain way, and they have a website or whatever, or a form
I'll
to fill
leave
out.
that to Beck is the right person to do that.
The only woman in the room, of course. I'll
Mike,
take your
you
notes.
do
I'll send your emails. I'm joking.
I'll take the action item from this meeting.
There you go. All right, we'll put it on Mike. Beck's got enough things to do in her daily job, right?
Yeah.
So the Security Standards Council, they sort of exist in an ivory tower to some degree, and while some of what they do is by design, I think they inadvertently back into things in both directions. Like the PADSS, for example, it was designed initially to be a companion to the PCI DSS to cover software and payment applications, and was designed to cover everything that the PCI DSS didn't cover directly. So, where in the early days were you seeing applications, e-commerce applications? Probably 95% of the e-commerce applications out there were exempt from PADSS because PADSS is intended for commercial offerings, off-the-shelf applications. Anytime it's custom, or what PCI calls bespoke, it's exempt from doing PADSS. So there's this program out there that I've never really understood because I've rarely seen payment applications that qualify and therefore go through the PADSS. Gotcha. But I've seen a whole lot of other applications out there that should probably have gone through it that didn't.
Right. So I was just going to say,
point of sale vendors,
point of sale vendors.
Same.
That's a different program.
Okay.
They're not covered.
When people go to securityweekly.com/Coalfire, I guess why would people want to go there? Tell us about Coalfire and encourage our audience to, if they're struggling with certain things specifically, where Coalfire comes in.
Sure. So Coalfire is a cyber risk advisory firm. We've been around since 2001. We do a lot in the compliance space, obviously, as we're talking about here, particularly in PCI and FedRAMP. We're also an ISO certifying body as well. We have a pretty large healthcare practice, but we can help any company develop their security program and improve their security posture across all the services in the companies. I'll talk about what we do. Coalfire Labs is where we have centralized all of our technical testing, penetration testing, red teaming, application security analysis and testing, social engineering, vulnerability assessments, and all of those things that don't quite fit into that audit bucket.
Sure.
So all of that technical work is where we have our subject matter experts and our center of excellence for those services. So we can help organizations to understand what a real-world adversary may be able to do to harm their business, all the way down to demonstrating compliance with a particular standard through the testing we do.
And Beck, how long have you worked in the ASV
realm
program for Coalfire?
Going on 5 years.
Yeah,
almost 5 years.
And I thought it was interesting is you really have to spend a lot of time to really develop a mature program. And I got a chance to see Tenable from the beginning and have a program and all of those things. And it's really just experience, right? That
it is, and it's exposure, and it's knowing all the subtle nuances that come with exposure over time. That's why to become ASV certified at an employee or a personal level instead of a company level, you have to have 5 years experience networking, pen testing, scanning, and audit. And then the fifth year is one more of a duplicate of the ones that I just mentioned, or some equivalent certification like your CISSP. And then to get your CISSP is another rigmarole of years of experience. So it's highly trained individuals. It's very technical individuals that do this stuff. It's not an easy program to get into. And in all honesty, it's not an easy program to manage, but it's fun because it's a constant challenge. Things change all the time, and we have these awesome intellectual discussions about what is risk, what is security, how can we make the world a better place. So
awesome. Yeah. Well, I encourage everyone to visit securityweekly.com/Coalfire. And we will take a short break and come back with the news, so stay tuned.